Bien, nous allons pouvoir reprendre le fil de nos discussions. Et c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de présenter Patricia Zalamea, qui est professeure dans le département d'histoire de l'art de l'Universidad de los Andes à Bogota, Colombie. Elle est spécialisée dans l'art de la Renaissance et ses appropriations en Colombie notamment, et elle s'intéresse à la globalisation des images pour la période moderne. Elle a participé à plusieurs projets financés d'ampleur, dont Unfolding Art History in Latin America, qui était financé par le Getty. Et son intérêt pour la circulation transnationale des images et son expertise en matière de réappropriation du visuel en situation coloniale l'ont porté à s'intéresser en particulier maintenant au 19e et à la photographie. Elle travaille en ce moment à l'INHA autour d'un projet qui est lié à la présentation qu'elle va faire aujourd'hui.
Voilà. Bon, merci encore. Je voudrais commencer par remercier le Quai Branly et très vivement Christine Barthes, avec qui on a eu une conversation très productive l'année dernière. Je voudrais également remercier l'INHA, où je suis actuellement, pour le soutien à ses recherches, ainsi qu'à mon université en Colombie, l'Université de los Andes. Ce que je veux présenter aujourd'hui fait partie d'un projet de recherche plus large qui se concentre sur la figure de l'artiste, telle qu'elle est représentée à travers les portraits, les biographies pendant la transition de la période coloniale et dans la Colombie au long du XIXe siècle. Plus précisément, je me concentre sur la manière dont les artistes ont expérimenté avec différents médias dans l'autoreprésentation en se basant sur des modèles classiques, bien que dans des circonstances extraordinaires au cours des premières années post-indépendance, dans le pays qui plus tard sera connu comme la Colombie, mais où les conflits politiques internes ont régné tout au long du siècle. Aujourd'hui, je me concentrerai sur un chapitre spécifique lié aux premiers portraits au daguerréotype qui ont été produits en Colombie dans les années 1840 et 50 au sein d'un cercle international de peintres et photographes qui coexistaient à Bogota. Pour explorer la manière dont les tensions entre l'imitation et l'observation ont été un thème majeur du portrait du 19e dans le contexte colombien, je me pencherai sur les œuvres de Luis García Hevia, l'un des premiers artistes colombiens à avoir créé un studio de daguerréotype professionnel, initialement en partenariat avec l'artiste nord-américain Louis Armstrong Bennett. La photographie s'est développée très tôt en Colombie, en partie grâce à l'arrivée du baron Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros en tant que diplomate français en 1839. Il convient de noter que tout cela s'est déroulé bien avant la création de l'Académie officielle colombienne des arts, fondée en 1886. Cette chronologie, comme nous le verrons, rompt avec la manière traditionnelle dont l'art académique et la photographie sont habituellement liés. Ma présentation sera divisée en deux parties. Je commencerai par définir la place de García Hevia dans l'histoire de l'art colombien du 19e et je me concentrerai sur l'un de ses premiers portraits peints avant d'examiner les décennies spécifiques des années 1840 et 50. Donc voici une image qu'on a tous pu voir ici dans l'exposition. Élève de Pedro José Figueroa, que vous voyez ici à droite, l'un des principaux artistes de la période coloniale tardive dans l'actuelle Colombie, Luis García Hevia fut à la fois un peintre et un photographe novateur, spécialisé dans le portrait et le premier à expérimenter les daguerréotypes dans le pays, alors connu sur le nom de Nouvelle Grenade. Comme beaucoup d'artistes qui ont travaillé dans la Colombie de la post-indépendance, il a participé directement aux conflits armés et aux guerres civiles du siècle. D'une part, on pourrait dire que cela a influencé sa façon de voir et qu'il a produit certaines des premières photographies testimoniales de la région, comme nous le verrons. D'autre part, cela n'a pas servi les objectifs de l'enseignement artistique. Aucune académie officielle n'a été créée avant 1886, bien que Hevia était un des premiers partisans de la création d'une académie officielle de peinture et du dessin dans les années 1840. Son œuvre s'étend sur 4 décennies, des années 1830 jusqu'à 1870. À la fin du 19e, Hevia était considéré comme un héros artistique par ses compatriotes et les nouvelles générations d'artistes. Ses grands-parents avaient participé à l'indépendance du pays par rapport à l'Espagne, un processus qui s'est déroulé au cours de la deuxième décennie du 19e. Un fait que García Hevia a souligné dans ses propres mémoires de 1886 et qui a été célébré dans les publications posthumes à la gloire des héros de l'indépendance, même au début du XXe siècle, comme vous pouvez voir ici à gauche. Et je vous montre aussi un plan pour vous rappeler les processus de l'indépendance en Amérique latine. Certains historiens de l'art, par exemple Beatriz González, ont souligné la singularité des artistes colombiens du XIXe siècle, dont la plupart ont été impliqués à un moment ou à un autre dans les différents conflits politiques et militaires qui ont traversé le siècle. D'une part, la participation des artistes à ces contextes souligne le développement d'une approche de l'art fondée sur le témoignage de première main. Outre les peintures rétrospectives de bataille comme celle de José María Espinosa à droite, qui a participé aux guerres d'indépendance, des artistes comme García Hevia ont commencé à utiliser la photographie pour enregistrer des événements spécifiques, comme cette vue de l'église de Saint-Augustin après sa prise par l'armée pendant la guerre civile de 1860. Dans le même temps, les conflits politiques en cours n'ont pas permis le développement des académies artistiques et institutions appropriées pour l'enseignement des arts. Le récit poursuit en affirmant que, par conséquent, les artistes se sont débrouillés toutes seules. Selon cette trame historiographique, deux modèles héroïques se peuvent voir. Par exemple, ces artistes ici, José María Espinosa et Ramón Torres Méndez, vus ici à travers leur autoportrait, sont souvent considérés comme des exceptions plutôt que comme la norme. Néanmoins, une perspective qui inclut les réseaux et met l'accent sur les continuités plutôt que sur le point de départ peut offrir une compréhension plus riche de la place des artistes colombiens au XIXe par rapport à ce que l'art académique commence à se valoriser en relation avec le passé à la fois classique et colonial, dans un contexte particulier avec ses propres histoires et spécificités locales, tout en dialoguant avec un contexte mondial. Permettez-moi de donner un exemple de la manière dont, en se concentrant sur l'un des premiers portraits de Hevia, on peut aborder la question des idées circulant sur la théorie artistique et le statut de l'artiste bien avant la fondation de la première académie officielle en Colombie. Et évidemment aussi avant la photographie. Signé par Luis García Hevia et daté de 1836, son portrait de son maître, Pedro José Figueroa, est à la fois un hommage et une image consciente d'elle-même, qui réfléchit à la valeur de la ressemblance et déclare explicitement une série de principes classiques pour la construction de l'image idéale. En plus de jouer sur la tradition du portrait posthume et utiliser un piédestal, l'image inclut un poème citant appels, tout en réfléchissant à la faiblesse de la copie et à la valeur de la mémoire visuelle. Posé sur une base hexagonale en pierre, ce portrait ovale représente un personnage de 3/4 portant un nœud papillon, un gilet à fleurs et un habit bleu, ce qui indique clairement le statut social du protagoniste. Encadré dans un ovale entouré de feuilles de laurier, ce format, et en général sa composition, évoque d'autres portraits allégoriques tels que le buste couleur chair de José Celestino Mutis, le célèbre naturaliste qui a dirigé l'expédition botanique jusqu'au début des procès d'indépendance. Contrairement au buste de Mutis, qui repose également sur un piédestal, mais est intégré dans un paysage, comme vous voyez ici, le portrait de García Hevia insère son protagoniste dans un autre niveau de représentation, une image dans une image, afin de réfléchir à la permanence et à la présence des images. À l'instar de l'autoportrait de Bartolomeo Murillo, datant du XVIIe, qui a également circulé sous forme d'estampes et dont l'inscription est aussi suggestive. Le laurier et le pédestal sont des éléments classiques qui répondent à une tradition dans le domaine du portrait. Outre la palette en tant qu'attribut du peintre et référence évidente à l'activité artistique, un poème manuscrit placé sur le papier pliant qui suit joliment la bordure de la pierre fournit des informations spécifiques sur les protagonistes de cette image. En même temps, il expose des notions théoriques sur l'art, en particulier sur l'art de l'imitation et le rôle de la mémoire et de l'observation dans la création artistique. Vous pouvez le lire ici pendant que je finis de parler de ce portrait. Donc vous voyez, il y a une comparaison implicite avec le célèbre peintre grec Apelle et donc avec l'Antiquité dans un sens plus général, ainsi que l'utilisation des motifs classiques concernant la capacité de la peinture à rappeler, à représenter, montrant que ce cercle artiste s'était approprié des idées courantes dans la théorie de l'art. L'accent mis sur la faiblesse de la copie, le désir nostalgique d'une reproduction correcte de l'image mentale, relie les notions d'image, de copie, de mémoire et de présence. D'une manière plus générale, le poème évoque les concepts liés à des idées européennes anciennes concernant la créativité. En particulier, les notions de fantaisie, désignant l'invention et la capacité de donner vie à une représentation, tout en indiquant que le maître a transmis à son élève la capacité de donner vie à l'image. En espagnol, aliento signifie souffle, mais a également une signification existentielle. De même, la notion que les images mentales nous survivent et perdurent est présente tout au long de cette représentation. Les vers se finissent sur un ton nostalgique, avec l'impression que, quelle que soit la vivacité de l'image remémorée, sa reproduction complète est pratiquement impossible, que nos créations ne sont que de faibles copies. Cette fausse modestie, bien sûr, est un autre lieu commun. L'idée inhérente est que derrière de tels hommages à un maître, il y a l'idée toujours présente que l'élève hérite du talent, mais aussi le de passe. Qu'il s'agisse d'un portrait posthume ou d'un hommage intellectuel à un maître vieillissant, l'idée que le portrait a été exécuté par mémoire fait partie de l'évocation ludique aussi de cette théorie artistique. L'histoire de cette image, je crois, témoigne la manière dont les notions apparemment opposées d'art colonial et d'art républicain, plus tard art académique, ont été interprétées et comprises par différents acteurs tout au long du XIXe. Cette peinture, en fait, relie trois générations d'artistes. D'une part, comme on a vu, celle du maître, Pedro José Figueroa, connu aussi comme un des principaux portraitistes de Bolivar et les autres héros de l'indépendance. D'autre part, celle de son élève, Luis García Hevia, le créateur de l'image. Et une troisième génération, Alberto Urdaneta, le fondateur de l'Académie officielle des arts en 1886. Lorsque l'école des beaux-arts de Urdaneta a finalement ouvert ses portes en 1886, elle a été inaugurée par une exposition présentant plus de 2000 objets provenant de diverses collections. Le portrait de Figueroa a été présenté aux côtés de maîtres anciens et des peintures coloniales lors de la première exposition annuelle de l'école des beaux-arts. L'idée que l'histoire de l'art colombien commençait avec l'art colonial et que l'art colonial était comparable aux grands maîtres européens était au cœur de la fondation de l'Académie. Un catalogue a été imprimé à la manière des expositions françaises dans le but de souligner pour un public plus large l'idée que l'art a toujours été une activité riche et continue en Colombie. Donc, je vous montre je l'ai laissée en anglais, mais ça vous donne un peu une idée de ce qui se passe au 19e dans les arts, mais aussi politiquement, beaucoup de changements que vous pouvez voir en dessous. Après cette présentation de García Hevia et la façon dont son art a traversé le siècle, ainsi qu'un résumé de certaines des questions historiographiques liées à l'étude des artistes dans le contexte de la Colombie du 19e et au développement de la formation académique, passons au chapitre spécifique concernant les daguerréotypes et la fabrication d'images dans les années 40 et 50 à Bogota. Comme on a déjà vu, les daguerréotypes ont été produits très tôt en Colombie, en partie grâce au baron Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros, diplomate français qui a vécu en Colombie en tant que chargé d'affaires entre 1839 et 1842, et qui était réputé pour ses peintures de paysages lors de ses voyages en Amérique latine. Voici quelques exemples, en Mexique et aussi de la Colombie. En effet, l'un des premiers daguerreotypes de l'histoire de la photographie montre une rue de Bogota, prise par le baron Gros, datée de 1842, au dos de laquelle il a enregistré un temps d'exposition de 47 secondes. Une autre de ces scènes, et voici une mise en scène actuelle avec le daguerreotype avec des couleurs et aussi la rue telle qu'elle existe maintenant. Une autre de ces scènes bien connues de Bogota est celle de la cathédrale principale, située sur la place du marché central, aujourd'hui connue sur le nom de Plaza de Bolívar, également enregistrée par des autres artistes itinérants de l'époque, comme vous pouvez voir ici. Le baron Gros est arrivé donc en Colombie en 1839, après avoir séjourné au Mexique et au Venezuela. Il avait auparavant séjourné en Espagne et en Égypte aussi. À la date de son arrivée à Cartagena, le 25 juin de 1839, l'Académie des sciences de Paris n'avait pas encore proclamé l'invention du daguerreotype, qui ont fait en août de la même année. La nouvelle de l'invention est publiée en Colombie le 22 septembre dans un journal local, El Observador, qui publie également le même jour une note faisant état de l'arrivée du baron Gros dans le pays. 2 mois plus tard, le même journal publiait un avis plus spécifique intitulé El daguerrotipo, qui donnait de brèves instructions sur la manière de réaliser les daguerreotypes. Ces informations ont été fournies en partie par le baron Gros, on ne sait pas. Quoi qu'il en soit, pendant son séjour en Colombie, il a développé des daguerreotypes avec du matériel importé et en étudiant sûrement des manuels. Comme l'a noté Marcela Camargo dans son thèse de master publiée récemment, dans quelques notes sur la photographie sur plaque métallique, un livre de 1850, le baron Gros rappelle que les lentilles lui ont été envoyées de Paris en Amérique par Charles Chevalier. De plus, dans la lettre publiée par Charles Chevalier dans son recueil de mémoires et procédés nouveaux concernant la photographie sur plaque métallique de 1847, il est évident que le baron Gros s'intéresse beaucoup aux procédés techniques. Son récit détaillé qu'il annonce pour vouloir partager pour le bénéfice de tous comporte des figures, comme on voit ici, pour mieux s'expliquer. Par ailleurs, nous avons aperçu des difficultés à s'engager dans la procédure à distance. Lorsque le baron Gros explique qu'il entre dans les détails, parce qu'il se souvient que de l'autre côté de l'océan, j'ouvre entre virgules, j'avais maudit les auteurs de notices qui étaient parus trop compter sur mon intelligence. Je ferme virgule. Le recueil comprend également des publicités de Chevalier, je vous montre ici, sur la qualité de ses équipements et ses recommandations pour les acheteurs à distance. Lors de ses séjours en Argentine, Angleterre et en Grèce, le baron Gros poursuit ses expériences avec les daguerreotypes, comme vous voyez ici. Ces compositions soigneusement étudiées de ce site extérieur sont souvent remarquées. Le baron Gros est également l'un des fondateurs de la Société héliographique et puis de la Société française de photographie à la moitié du siècle. La conscience qu'il avait de la création de l'image est révélée dans ces 2 daguerreotypes, prises dans la même pièce de sa maison à Paris, où les images deviennent le sujet de l'image elle-même. Comme nous l'avons vu précédemment, le baron Gros était également très impliqué dans les réflexions techniques, comme en témoignent ses écrits théoriques et ses publications sur la photographie des années 1840 et 50. Bien que l'on suppose parfois qu'il n'a pas poursuivi ses expériences après la fin des années 50, en raison de ses voyages en Chine, l'inventaire de sa maison après son décès en 1870 reflète non seulement ses voyages à travers le monde en tant que diplomate, mais note plusieurs daguerreotypes et équipements photographiques, une question qui mérite d'être étudiée plus en détail. En outre, dans son testament de 1865, il met l'accent sur 2 pièces spécifiques liées à son séjour en Amérique latine. Le premier objet énuméré qu'il laisse à des amis proches sont un de ses propres tableaux réalisés au Mexique, ici souligné à gauche, et un bijou en filigrane qui lui a été offert à la Nouvelle-Granade, souligné ici à droite. À l'époque où le baron Gros est arrivé à Bogota, García Hevia était un jeune peintre reconnu pour ses portraits dans ce que l'on pourrait appeler un style colonial tardif de transition, suivant celui de son maître Figueroa, que, comme nous l'avons vu précédemment, avait été le portraitiste de Bolivar et autres héros de l'indépendance, comme je vous montre ici. Caractérisés par le fait qu'ils sont relativement plats, avec une inscription sous-jacente qui souligne la biographie et les principales réalisations du personnage représenté, ces portraits suivent les principes de la peinture coloniale tardive. Certains suivent des compositions de type colonial, comme aussi dans ce portrait de groupe dans la scène à grande échelle de la mort de Santander. Et d'autres sont des portraits rétrospectifs des héros, pardon, c'était celle-ci, des héros tués 20 ans plus tôt. Cependant, contrairement au portrait colonial, les portraits de García Hevia étaient particulièrement réalistes dès le départ. Il avait tendance à souligner les particularités individuelles de ce modèle, une caractéristique qu'on retrouve à la fois dans ses peintures et dans ses daguerreotypes, comme on peut voir dans ces exemples. Il convient de noter qu'en 1841, un an avant le daguerreotype du baron Gros des scènes de Bogota, García Hevia avait remporté le 3e prix de l'exposition industrielle de Bogota avec 2 de ses propres daguerreotypes. Malheureusement, nous ne connaissons pas le sujet. Nommé essai ou ensayos, il est probable qu'il s'agissait des premières images expérimentales, probablement des vues de sites comme celles que le baron Gros développait à la même époque, car il était plus facile à photographier que les personnes en raison des temps d'exposition nécessaires pour les premiers daguerreotypes. Nous savons également que d'autres artistes, tels que José Gabriel Tatis, que l'on voit dans ce autoportrait, ont également expérimenté les daguerreotypes à cette époque. Ceux-ci étaient considérés comme des processus techniques qui trouvaient souvent leur place dans les catégories des arts, mais des innovations industrielles. Les résultats de ces premières expériences doivent être mis en relation avec la circulation des connaissances. L'importation des manuels français sur la photographie, la physique et la chimie a été étudiée par Marcela Camargo dans sa thèse. Par exemple, les mélanges photographiques de Charles Chevalier sont arrivés en 1845, dans le cadre d'une vaste entreprise gouvernementale d'importation directe de livres provenant de Paris. D'autres ont circulé par la première librairie établie dans la ville en 1851 par un Français, Jean Simoneau. Entre ce livre, on trouve aussi les livres de chimie d'Édouard Robin, également disponibles depuis 1843. Comme dans d'autres cas qu'on a vus, les débuts de la photographie ont été un processus à plusieurs niveaux, dans lequel les circonstances spécifiques ont permis des expérimentations simultanées. Je dois noter que les études plus récentes sur ces sujets, comme celles de Camargo, mais aussi de Halim Badawi, Juanita Solano, Ángela Gómez et Efraín Ortiz Domínguez, examinent de plus près ces réseaux de circulation des connaissances, ajoutant des niveaux précieux pour aider à démêler les multiples façons dont les daguerreotypes se sont développés en Colombie, tout en s'appuyant sur les études antérieures de Eduardo Serrano, Beatriz González et Pilar Moreno de Ángel. Au cours de cette même décennie, García Hevia ouvre 2 académies. La première en 1843 à son domicile, présentée comme une académie de dessin offrant des cours privés. En 1846, à une échelle plus ambitieuse, il inaugure une académie de peinture et de dessin avec d'autres artistes de renom. Bien que de courte durée, cette tentative de créer une approche plus institutionnelle de l'art nous dit comment García Hevia pensait. Dans les années 50, García Hevia exploite une galerie de daguerreotypes avec le Nord-américain John Armstrong Bennett, qui arrive de New York en Colombie pour la première fois en 1848, où il occupera ensuite le poste diplomatique de consul de 1851 à 56. Il avait vécu avant en Uruguay entre 1842 et 1844 et auparavant en Alabama, où il avait aussi son étude de photographie. La galerie de Bennett publiait des portraits sur mesure en fonction de la taille et du prix et représentait certaines des figures politiques les plus puissantes de l'époque. Ici, 3 hommes politiques qui ont été impliqués dans les guerres d'indépendance de différentes manières et qui sont tous devenus présidents, parfois des factions opposées. Au cours de ce voyage, Bennett a recommandé sa galerie à Evia et à Henry Price, le consul anglais et aussi un aquarelliste réputé qui a réalisé des importantes scènes de la vie colombienne au cours du 19e. On a longtemps pensé à une photo de Price avec Evia, mais ce n'est pas très clair. Enfin, c'est quelque chose d'autre à vérifier. En plus de populariser l'accès au portrait, cette activité a permis à Garcia Evia de réorienter son travail artistique tout en augmentant sa production. La publicité de ce studio reflète le besoin imminent de préserver l'image du défunt. Reflétant sur l'incertitude de la vie, les textes commencent par des appels exclamatifs, entre virgules. Que donnerais-je pour le portrait d'un ami? Cette exclamation n'a plus le même sens. Seuls quelques-uns peuvent la prononcer, car le prix de ces tableaux ne doit pas être un obstacle, car même les plus pauvres peuvent acquérir un objet de consolation aussi désirable. Je vais faire virgule. Une autre annonce de 1853, entre virgules, garantit l'exactitude et la beauté des personnages représentés. Garcia Evia a poursuivi ses expériences en croisant les médias. Il a commencé à appliquer de la peinture sur ses photographies qu'il a appelées oléotypes et dont il a vanté la vraisemblance. Il disait que celle-ci imite encore plus la nature, car à la ressemblance exacte offerte par la machine s'ajoute la vraisemblance offerte par la couleur, avec toute la beauté, la douceur de l'huile à l'avantage de la durée offerte par les images anciennes. Les daguerreotypes dans cette exposition sont un bon exemple de ce modèle idéal qu'on a pu voir l'année dernière avec Christine Barthes en détail, mais on n'a pas trouvé encore de l'évidence, en vrai, de l'huile, mais bon, de la couleur, tout à fait. Bennett et Evia se sont spécialisés dans le portrait de l'élite locale, comme en témoignent les daguerreotypes qu'on peut voir ici. L'identité de certains de ces personnages a été récemment reconnue par Maria Fernanda Domínguez comme étant les portraits de jeunesse de 2 hommes politiques importants. À gauche, le président 2 fois, Manuel Murillo Toro, qui, à début des années 50, donc on a pris l'image, était secrétaire de l'économie dans un autre gouvernement. Et à la droite, Victoriano de Diego Paredes, aussi secrétaire de ce même gouvernement en 1850, mais de relations internationales. À l'époque, ils auraient eu entre 30 et 40 ans. Une comparaison avec des autres images, comme vous voyez ici, permet plus ou moins confirmer cette idée sur les identités. Dans certains de ces portraits plus tardifs, à partir des années 50, l'inscription sous-jacente utilisée à l'époque coloniale est parfois incluse. Mais les visages, en particulier dans les portraits posthumes, sont encore plus réalistes. Comme l'ont noté autres chercheurs, certains des portraits peints plus tard par Evia semblent rappeler les ressemblances photographiques et pourraient même avoir utilisé des photographies d'hommes et de femmes décédés comme base de travail. L'aspect réaliste de ce portrait attribué au musée de Denver est particulièrement frappant. De même, il avait déjà l'habitude, dans les années 30, de faire des portraits de mémoire ou de personnes décédées, comme on a vu avant. Et parallèlement, certains de ces daguerreotypes, comme ceux qu'on a vus dans l'exposition et dans cette diapositive, tendent à offrir une image soigneusement construite de ces modèles qui partagent des poses vues dans les peintures du portrait, mais qui restent parfois idéalisées. Ici, je compare l'un de ces daguerreotypes colorés avec le portrait peint d'une écrivaine bien connue, Josefa Acevedo. Cependant, comme mentionné précédemment, Evia a également pris certaines des premières photographies documentées du type témoignage, comme cette copie sur albumine, une des premières produites dans le pays, d'un groupe de criminels qui se sont assis pour Evia alors qu'ils étaient en prison avant leur exécution. Si la ressemblance est une question qui se pose en peinture, ça se complique encore avec l'utilisation de la photographie. À la fin du 19e, l'utilisation des références photographiques en peinture devient un débat majeur dans les milieux artistiques et l'académie. En effet, tout comme il a été célébré par certains de ses collègues artistes dans sa vieillesse, Evia a également fait l'objet de critiques pour avoir trop mis sur le réalisme et la photographie. Dans un article ironique de ce certain José David Guarín, se référant à un portrait intérieur réalisé par Evia de l'auteur et d'un groupe d'amis éditeurs d'une revue, il dit « J'ai vu un groupe où je me reconnais en union avec autres 4 personnes, mais pour dire la vérité, je ne connais pas ni les personnes ni à moi-même. Tu as pourtant perdu ton temps, Evia, et pour que cela ne se passe à nouveau, je prends la liberté de te conseiller que quand tu auras à portraiter quelqu'un, tu dois l'appeler, puisque c'est très dangereux de te fier de ta mémoire, surtout quand tu vas le faire depuis de la photographie. Quoi qu'il en soit, Evia est considéré comme un élément fondamental dans la diffusion de la photographie en Colombie. Malgré son approche novatrice de la création d'images, Evia est parfois, ou beaucoup de fois, vu comme un artiste de transition entre la période postcoloniale et la République. J'affirme que son travail réfléchit à la valeur de la ressemblance tout en transformant une série de principes classiques pour la construction de l'image idéale. En outre, ces pratiques, ainsi que de tentatives de fonder diverses académies de dessin, témoignent de la circulation de diverses théories sur la création. García Evia était également un collectionneur de peintures coloniales, dont beaucoup, comme ses propres œuvres, ont été transmises à Urdaneta, le fondateur de l'Académie. L'analyse des modes de production de García Evia et sa lignée coloniale nuance la manière dont les notions apparemment opposées d'imagerie coloniale et républicaine, plus tard académique, ont été interprétées. Enfin, les multiples intersections entre la peinture et la photographie compliquent encore davantage la question de la vraisemblance. En conclusion, penser à une tradition classique dans le contexte colombien remet en question non seulement les dates traditionnelles, mais aussi la notion même de ce que peut signifier, par exemple, l'académisation de l'art et la manière dont elle se rapporte au passé classique et à la modernité en même temps. Si la pratique artistique de García Evia est issue d'une modèle colonial dont la signification même a été réinterprétée, son utilisation des daguerreotypes en tant que support spécial capable de transformer la tradition, tout en produisant des interprétations improvisées du contexte immédiat, signale la fluidité avec laquelle les concepts et les médias européens peuvent être remplacés. Bien qu'elles ressemblent en apparence à leur homologue française, ces images reflètent les espaces et les contextes dans lesquels elles ont été conçues et produites. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Patricia. Je vais introduire avant qu'on lance la vidéo cette fois, le dernier intervenant, c'est ça. On va avoir le plaisir d'écouter Jörg Schneider, qui est historien rattaché au Centre d'études africaines de Bâle en Suisse. Sa recherche et ses enseignements portent sur le patrimoine photographique africain et en particulier sur les producteurs d'images en Afrique de l'Ouest et en Afrique centrale. Il a écrit et publié en particulier sur le paysage atlantique, visuel atlantique, Atlantic Visualscapes, entre la Grande-Bretagne, l'Amérique du Sud et l'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui voit notamment dans la seconde moitié du 19e d'intenses circulations à la fois d'images et de producteurs d'images entre les différents lieux que je viens de décrire et qui bouleversent bien évidemment certaines idées reçues sur la géographie du médium à l'époque. Son article, que je vais citer parce qu'il est très très bien, c'est « The Topography of the Early History of African Photography », qui a été publié dans History of Photography, qui est une référence en la matière. Notre collègue ne se contente pas d'analyser les sources et les archives, il participe à leur mise en valeur et à leur conservation, puisqu'il est le cofondateur de African Photography Initiatives, qui est une organisation qui vise à aider à la protection d'archives photographiques avec des programmes de conservation, de numérisation et de sensibilisation. Et je vous encourage à aller voir le site internet de cette association qui mérite tout notre intérêt. Voilà, voir le site internet de cette association qui mérite tout notre intérêt. Voilà.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your invitation to present 3 photographies on the island of Fernando Po, a highly attractive and inexhaustible motif. Fernando Po is the largest of a series of islands in the Gulf of Guinea. The volcanic island the Portuguese discovered in 1472 measures only 70 to 32 kilometers, and the highest summit is 3,000 meters high. On October 1, 1777, the Treaty of San Ildefonso was signed. In the agreement, Portugal ceded the islands of Fernando Po, Annobon, and both Elobis, as well as the coastline between the mouths of the Niger and the Ogowe, about this area. However, although Fernando Po was now Spanish, there was no Spanish representative until the second half of the 19th century. In fact, British traders, John Beecroft until 1854, and William Linslager after him, actually acted as Spanish governors until 1858. The language multi-talented Richard Burton was British consul in Fernando Po between 1861 and 65, but spent most of his time traveling in West and Central Africa. In the early 1840s, the Baptist Missionary Society, with the participation of black Christians from Jamaica, established itself on Fernando Po. They were expelled from the island in 1858 when Catholic missionaries moved in. However, by 1870, the Primitive Methodist Mission Society had reopened a school in Santa Isabel, as the island's capital, formerly Clarence, was now called. The transatlantic slave trade came to an end officially in 1807. Between 1827 and 1835, the British used Fernando Po as an anti-slaving base, and only a few years after their withdrawal, even seriously negotiated with Spain for the purchase of the island. The deal did not happen, but eventually, after years of hesitation and negligence, Spain sent the naval officer Carlos Chacon to Fernando Po in 1858 in an effort to set up a proper colonial administration. After Chacon's arrival in 1858, and in those early years of Spain's renewed colonial enthusiasm, the Vizconde de San Javier, the chief of customs and taxes for the Spanish crown's possessions in the Gulf of Guinea, spent 3 years from 1860 to 1863 on Fernando Po, traveling all over the place. On the mainland opposite Fernando Po, but around the same time, the French naval officers Paul Serval and Griffon du Bellay explored the West and Central African coast, visiting France's fleet bases in Assigny, Grand Bassam, and Gabon. Griffon du Bellay published a detailed account of the voyage in Le Tour du Monde, an illustrated newspaper, in 1865, richly illustrated with faithful reproductions of photographs, as he wrote. Introducing illustrations corrected what, in his opinion, earlier travelogues lacked for acceptance. Griffon du Bellay explicitly thanked the naval officer Ouzé d'Aulnoy, who had made available to Tour du Monde the fine collections of photographs he had taken in Gabon. You will find more about Ouzé d'Aulnoy in the exhibition catalogue. Like the French, the Vizconde de San Javier also considered photography to be the preferred means of visual communication with the Spanish administration, and eventually a broader Spanish audience. A photo album which contains 24 photographs from Fernando Po on the island of Chorisco, showing buildings, people and scenery bears witness to the Spanish office's attempt to promote Spain's only sub-Saharan possession in the metropole. Here the cover of the photo album of the Visconde de San Javier, 1860s, early 1860s, and here one of the photographs shows some buildings on the rim of the crater which builds the bay of Santa Isabel. Here's the bay with the church here on the right, and here a building for the employees of the administration. Just take a note of the church and this building because there is detailed photographs in the album here from the employees' quarters, and there was another one from the church. The Visconde had a photo album intended for the Spanish administration, but a selection of the photographs also appeared in the journal El Museo Universal, accompanying his travel account Viaje al África Central y la Isla de Fernando Po, clearly in an attempt to popularize and promote Spain's colonial endeavors in Africa. Here, the reproduction, the original photograph, and the reproduction in the journal El Museo Universal. Same here, the original photographs and the reproduction in the journal. In the following years, Spain tried to encourage immigration from the metropole and Cuba to Fernando Po. However, this met with little success and even less sustainability. Hence, at the beginning of the 1870s, and after more than 10 years of Spanish administration, the process of colonization had reached none of its objectives, neither materially nor with regard to Catholic proselytization. Nevertheless, the settlement of people from other parts of Africa who had been freed from slave traders by the British anti-slavery squadrons patrolling off the West African coast and settled in Fernando Po, that had started in the early 19th century after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, led to the formation of a group of Africans on Fernando Po, the Fernandinos, who predominantly Protestants, English-speaking and culturally oriented towards Victorian values, were as much strangers on the island as the white traders, the crew from Liberia, or the Spanish naval officers. Here we have a very early photograph, 1865-6, of the autochthone Bube population. Here, missionaries, it's the primitive Methodist missionaries. The crew, who also formed part of the population in Fernando Po and in particular in Santa Isabel or Clarence. Those were the people who worked in the trading stations on the ships all along the coast. They were from Liberia. Then, of course, white traders. Partially there were also black traders, so there were people from, for instance, from Senegal who were also working as traders in this area, and Spanish naval officers or clerks of the Spanish administration. And then the very mixed group of Fernandinos, of governor, clergy, naval officers that formed this very multinational, multicultural group in the capital. With the fall of the monarchy of Isabel II in September 1868, Spain's colonial enthusiasm in the Gulf of Guinea collapsed. The following revolutionary governments, troubled by continuous political and social strife, were not ready to continue financing the administration of a colony which had yielded no fruits so far. The metropole decided to scale down its financial support for the islands, relegating it to a simple naval base. The Gaceta de Madrid, in total agreement with the government, commented that Spain better concentrate on places where it could hope to establish a stable administrative regime, and the situation did not demand direct and continuous protection. So between September 1868 and December 1874, 11 governors, mainly in office at interim and only for a very short time, succeeded one another. The last governor during this troubled 6 years was Ignacio García Tudela, who remained in charge for the comparable lengthy period of 2 years, from September 72 to November 74. In December 1873, in the midst of his term, Governor Tudela sent a detailed report to Madrid, to the Ministerio de Ultramar. Without a solid footing there, on the island, the governor wrote, which is practice meant without military personnel to back the governor's authority, without missionaries capable of counteracting the influence of the Protestant missions, without entrepreneurs who were ready to invest capital, and without the markets that could absorb the colony's products. It was impossible to resist the British hegemony in the region. A timely and orderly withdrawal was, in García Tudela's view, the best way to avoid further futile spending. However, García Tudela's opinion was not heard anymore in the relevant circles of power after the sudden political change that had happened in Spain in December 1874. The new Alphonsine cabinet, heir to the Isabellian colonial and evangelical impulse, considered the colony's decadence rather to be the result of the unjust and disgraceful civil war than of the reasons Governor Tudela had put forward in his report. Consequently, the government expressed its intention to again take up its engagement in West Africa by nominating Diego Santisteban Chamorro, a 55-year-old Navy captain with long experiences in the Philippines, as governor of Fernando Po and commander of its marine base. Contrary to Tudela, Santisteban, like the Visconde de San Javier before him, stressed the great benefit Spain could gain from its neglected and practically unknown colony. In order to support his argument, he sent 14 photographs from Fernando Po to Madrid that were to bear visual, hence truthful, evidence of the Spanish possession's wealth and its inhabitants' interest in the economic development of the island. This is one of the 14 photographs, again, the church in Santa Isabel, again the church, the bay. Santisteban hoped that the Navy Ministry and the Colonial Ministry together would intercede with the new cabinet of Alfonso to remedy the colony's grave lack of finances. Impressed by these photographs and pushed by additional political and economic factors, the government of the Restoration reassumed the process of colonization. New capital was subsequently injected, definitively shelving previous propositions to get rid of the colony, which had at least been taken into consideration in the light of Garcia Tudela's pessimistic and negative report. The photographs Santisteban had sent to Madrid were taken by Francis W. Jouac, a native of Sierra Leone, who moved to Fernando Po in the late 1860s. There he took photographs of the local Fernandino community, white traders and the primitive Methodist mission before putting out feelers to Gabon, where he was to settle probably in the late 1870s or early 1880s. He then stayed in Libreville in Gabon for the next 10-15 years before returning to Sierra Leone, where he died in the 1890s, in the mid-1890s. Interestingly, and contrary to the Visconde 10 years earlier, Santisteban limited his visual arguments to the capital Santa Isabel. There were no images of dwellings outside Santa Isabel, no plantations, nothing of the island's exuberant beauty, but 2 times the church, as you have seen, and inevitably the spectacular bay that so welcomingly seemed to open its arms to the Spanish colonizers. Visual signifiers of civilization on this far-off island, such as the well-maintained houses, trimmed hedges, and not least the lampposts on the marina and in front of the church, conveyed a story of success and made the deadly climate forget. When there were differences between the Visconde and Santisteban's photographs, there were also something they shared. Both showed the various socio-cultural groups that composed the inhabitants of Fernando Po, the booby, the crew, and the mixed group consisting of Fernandinos, members of the government, the governor, the clergy, not really visible on this, but on another photographs, and traders and occasional visitors. By the early 1880s, Spain had a firm foothold on the island, and doubts about whether to stay or go had faded. New spiritual forces arrived with the community of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the Claretans, in Fernando Po in November 1883, to conquer hearts and souls, with Father Ciriaco Ramirez as apostolic prefect, and a state subsidy of 100,000 pesetas a year. Now was also the time to explain to a wider public the challenges and benefits of colonization in the context of an increasing European competition, the scramble for Africa underway, in which only a year later the Congress of Berlin was to define a new era. From 4 to 12 November 1883, the first Spanish Congress of Colonial and Mercantile Geography took place in Madrid, that reviewed the problems of Spain's colonies and sought to specify the most appropriate model of developing its possessions. José Montes de Oca, who had been governor of Fernando Po and would become so again in 1885, claimed that there were already good results in agriculture, stressing the government's role in its development. Ironically, only 15 years later, in the Spanish-American War, Spain would lose its most significant overseas colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Still, it was now also the time to lift Spain's colonial successes on an international level and stage. We are still in the early 1880s. To participate in the International Colonial and Export Exposition in Amsterdam, planned to be held between May and October 1883, the Spanish Central of the Amsterdam Colonial Exhibition, was created as well as a subcommission chaired by Mondes de Oca and composed of Lieutenant Commander Francisco Romera y Varela, Navy Doctor Antonio Jurado, and Naval Accountant Francisco Roca, as well as merchants and traders from the island. Romero had been appointed commander of the pontoon Trinidad and captain of the port of Santa Isabel in November 1880. He recorded the atmospheric data of the island that later appeared in the catalogue of the exhibition in Amsterdam, but also, and most importantly, he also provided 14 photographs the African photographer W.J. Sawyer took in the interior of the colony on his behalf, and which were later also on display in the exhibition in Amsterdam. This is one of the photographs Sawyer took on Romero's behalf. Another one showing the dwelling of a local king. These photographs show exclusively villages in the interior, local chiefs' plantations and their wives and retinue. In short, agricultural activities and local power structures. The photographs shown at the Amsterdam exhibition were later reproduced as engravings in La Ilustración Española y Americana. This allowed, as the Spanish author Carmen García Pérez noted, the images to be retouched, and in the case of the shot of the Botoko Williams farm, which shows the men tiling the soil to plant yam, to remove a booby posing nude in the foreground. Let's have a look at this photograph. So the booby tiling the soil for planting yams, and here is the nude person that, as you will see, has been removed by another person. But just take a look at these three people, at this group, the stick, maybe you take note of the stick, and the hat of this person. There's another person with a pipe in his mouth. So now what happened to the naked booby? Duck. So here you remember the stick, remember the person with the pipe in his mouth, you remember this was the head of the naked booby, but now he has another position and he is not naked anymore. García Pérez made another most interesting observation. She said, although anthropologically the documentary legacy is very valuable, it is nevertheless distorted, since all previous testimonies stated that it was women who cultivated yams. Men were reluctant to work in the fields, but when it came to the staging for the photographic pose, they were ready to pose while the women were relegated to play part of the king's harem. But this is not the end of a long series of photographers and photographs. Only 3 years later, Lieutenant Luis Orella was commissioned by royal decree to carry out a scientific expedition on Fernando Po. The series of photographs he commissioned to be taken showed him visiting, as the first European, as was underlined, King Mocha, but other views showed again the beautiful bay of Santa Isabel. Here, Luis Orella visiting King Mocha, Orella. And again, the bay. And so it went on in the coming years and decades, when the bay had already become iconic. The Visconde de San Javier's, Santisteban's, Romero's and Sorela's initiative to send photographic images to the metropole evidently was not their personal invention, but well in line with what other governmental officials, travelers, and mission societies had done before and in parallel with them, namely to use visual means to illustrate the infrastructure, people and environments in the colonies or places they explored and occupied. For the spectacle of empire, its modes and regimes of visibility were profoundly photographic, as the British historian and anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards noted in a paper she presented at the conference 2012 in Glasgow. Historian James R. Ryan, too, in his seminal book Picturing Empire, emphasized the important role photographs played for the imaginative geography of the colonial empires. I hope that I have succeeded in illustrating this interweaving of photographs and the colonial project through the example of Fernando Po. Early on, illustrated newspapers, which began to appear in large numbers from the 1840s onwards, were used to make these photographs and their associated messages accessible to a wider public. At the same time, while Spain became more confident and reassured of its sub-Saharan possessions, the audience of the photographs shifted from exclusively internal, the Spanish government and the ministries involved in the colonial project and the local audience, to a wider international audience. This reflected, at the same time, what was happening on a larger level, a greater competition for control over Africa's natural resources and peoples. Thank you very much. Merci. Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. C'est bon? Le son est revenu? Parfait. On va pouvoir entrer dans une phase de discussion avant d'entendre la clôture, la conférence de clôture. Patricia, tu peux revenir là.
On October 1,
il ne faut pas qu'on retourne dans la Twilight Zone là. Peut-être qu'il y a des questions pour Patricia pour commencer, le temps qu'on reconnecte avec Zoom. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Oui, on a une question ici. C'est bon. Ouais.
Oui, bonsoir. En dessous d'une des photos du baron Gros, il y avait écrit Tokyo. C'est là qu'elle est conservée?
Voilà, oui, effectivement, c'est à Tokyo. Je pense que j'ai oublié de dire le musée, mais oui, si on cherche en ligne, on trouve qu'elle est là.
Thank you, Patricia. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. I am really curious about the relationship, right, between the photograph, the daguerreotypes, and painting. There's very similar dynamics in Nigeria as well, where, you know, an early painter, hey, Jork, where an early painter, Onabalu, was quoted as saying that you know, daguerreotypes or photographs should not be a replacement for painting, right? That, and because he was constantly being asked to retouch photographs. And initially he did it, very freely, but then eventually he refused because he just said, you're better off commissioning a painting, right? So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that tension, and with the context of this conversation around observation, around memory, around truthfulness, right? Is there also some level of like an aesthetic relation or an aesthetic valuation that is placed on the two?
Yes, and I guess that's I'm going to answer in English. That's the biggest point of my research, is trying to exactly figure this out, because, and I mentioned this various times, the fact that photography really arrives well before there's an established, let's say, academy. There was a colonial tradition of painting, which were mostly family workshops, which of course used prints as models, amongst other things. So really, when photography arrives, there seems to be no issue, I would say no competing issue within the, let's say, most advanced painters who are also creating these academies. Very early on, there's a place for photographs, for the daguerreotype studios. So, and many of them are already painters. So I don't think there's a tension there, though, like I read, which is what is also fascinating, I think, about Evie in particular, and that's on two levels, is first the way that he advertises his daguerreotypes, trying to get people to get into this by saying they're even better than paintings, right? They're even more everlasting. And I'm particularly interested in the material question, which I'm after, is did he actually use oil, which would be very unusual. But the fact that he talks about this, says he's created this new invention, this oleotype, is very telling, even within the types of discussions that might be going on. So I think he doesn't have an issue. He's trying to bring this new medium in, and especially playing with the idea that this will be as long-lasting, but will be less expensive. So he's also trying to cater to a market. So I think it's on many different levels. And then the other point that I'm particularly interested in is to see whether daguerreotypes and the actual ability to create photographs, how did this affect their actual paintings? The thing is, a lot of these paintings have yet to be carefully researched. We need to have clear attribution, dates, and so forth. There's a lot of work to be done there to actually be able to compare them. And I'm not entirely convinced about the argument that has been going on for a long time, and it's that photography influenced him early on to make his images look a lot more realistic. Because if you look at the daguerreotypes, they seem to be these sort of perfect images, which do not have the realistic wrinkles that you get in all of the painted portraits of the more or less the same period. So that's sort of interesting to me. The paintings are not as idealized, and that's what characterizes his particular style. And there's a whole sort of realist kind of image making going on, again, before there was an academic model. And then when the academy actually gets formed in the 1880s, that's when the big discussion begins. And there's a whole faction of, and that's why I read that little piece at the end about people being very critical about the use of photography within the academy as a model, or using photography to paint someone that is not there, and things like that. So that's when the big, let's say, tension begins in a different way between media. Before, I think it's more about mixing media and about being experimental with the two different media. Thank you.
Est-ce que nous avons d'autres questions dans la salle, sachant que Jörg est connecté, il peut vous entendre. Tout le monde est connecté, vous pouvez poser des questions à tous les gens que vous voyez sur l'écran. Alors moi j'ai une question un peu pour tout le monde, mais ça va faire écho à ce que tu viens de dire. Il y a un historien assez connu en France qui est Marc Bloch, qui nous a, dans un texte fameux, mis en garde contre l'idole des origines, et qui, voilà, elle est un peu là dans la salle, hein, on cherche tous là, ces premiers daguerréotypes, des premiers lieux, des premières photographies. Et je me demande finalement voilà, si c'est vraiment un objet si signifiant que ça, au fond, quand on voit on dirait comment, overlapping médias, les différentes formes qui peuvent coexister dans ces premières années de la photographie. La question fondamentale, au fond, c'est est-ce qu'il y a vraiment une rupture photographique qui arrive à ce moment-là, hein, je parle vraiment des années 1840. Je pense que c'est un débat qui va agiter tout le monde dans les années à venir. Je sens que les Français vont être les premiers à dégainer, là, en 2027. Donc il y a un vrai enjeu, là, quelque part, de historiographique, puis de penser la photographie peut-être comme quelque chose qui n'est pas si individualisé que ça, au fond, dans ces moments-là. Donc je ne sais pas ce que tu en penses par rapport à tes objets de recherche.
Oui, tout à fait. Donc, dans la Colombie, en fait, c'est un fait qui nous fait très content de dire c'est un des premiers lieux où on voit la photographie, non, comme on le voit ici à l'exposition avec le plan. Mais en fait, quand on voit ça un peu plus, c'est pour ça que j'ai mentionné qu'en fait, avant la photographie du Baron Gros, on a ces essais de Evia Garcia qui ont même eu un prix. Mais en tout cas, je pense que ce qu'on voit dans tous ces cas, et évidemment au Brésil avec Hercule Florence, tout ça, c'est qu'il y a pas seulement des coïncidences parallèles, mais plutôt, on pourrait dire, une circulation des sensibilités qui, dans chaque lieu, je pense que c'est plus important que penser c'est arrivé ça ici avant que dans un autre lieu. C'est plutôt comment ces circulations de savoir sont dans un lieu spécifique, ont des répercussions différentes dans chaque cas. Et dans mon cas, je pense que c'est plus important le fait que la chronologie, dans un mode beaucoup plus général, est renversée avec l'académie. Et je pense que ça produit des autres choses. C'est pas tellement important si c'était avant ou après un autre pays, mais à la fin, c'est comment ça, dans un lieu spécifique, dialogue globalement, régionalement, et dans ce lieu en particulier.
Si les intervenants en ligne veulent tenter de répondre à ma question, n'hésitez pas.
Est-ce que je peux répondre sur la question de l'origine?
Bien sûr. Ouais.
Ouais. Donc, pour moi, ça dépend un peu dans quel monde cette nouvelle technologie entre. Donc, c'est qui rencontre cette nouvelle technologie d'image la première fois. Est-ce que c'était quelqu'un qui était déjà confronté, qui a déjà vécu dans un monde d'images peintes? Ou est-ce que c'était comme dans mon contexte en Afrique qui était un monde beaucoup moins, sinon sans images. Et là, je pense le choc était un vrai choc, ou pourrait être un vrai choc, contrairement à, disons, en Europe, où les gens avaient déjà l'habitude de voir des images, disons, dans les églises, etc., etc. Donc là, pour moi, ça dépend un peu du monde. Après aussi, comme parlons de la reproduction ou dans quel degré la photo a été perçue comme quelque chose qui montre la réalité. Donc pour moi, un indicateur pour cela est toujours quand il y avait des reproductions des photos dans les journaux, il était toujours, souvent il était écrit, il était souligné que la reproduction était basée sur une photographie. Donc pour moi, c'était un indicateur que la photographie avait un grand degré de reproduction de la réalité. Donc qu'on considérait la photographie comme le miroir du monde, d'une réalité extérieure.
Merci. On a des questions là-haut. Voilà, très bien. Peut-être Jonathan.
Thank you for these talks. My question is, and this is a rather large one, but we're getting to the end of the conference, I think. So, and I think it relates, because my question is essentially, do we, by enlarging the field in the way that this exposition and this conference do geographically, do we learn something new about photography, in the sense of, you know, there was another earlier process before the daguerreotype, for example, as we saw in the first half of this panel? Or are we learning something about global history, because we see the way that entrepreneurs were circulating between different colonies and parts of empires, and in that sense a kind of 19th century global history? Or are we learning just many different stories about many different places that don't necessarily add up to more than the sum of their parts? That's the big question. The smaller question, but maybe it's a way to get at this, for Jörg Steiner, is why look at Fernando Po specifically? What does that as a place show us about this larger story? I mean, it's an empire on the wane with many problems, as you explained. So what do we learn either about photography or about the larger 19th century story from looking at this example?
May I start with this second question? So why Fernando Po? Because, I mean, the simple answer would be, well, Fernando Po, because there's a lot of material about and from Fernando Po. So apparently at the time it was in the center of photography, or at the crossroads of photographies. So that's one reason. The other, I mean, what I find interesting is that, and I think I tried to show it, how photography accompanied something happening on the level of the island and on a larger scope, and so how photography accompanied such political and social processes, developments, evolutions. And that's, for me, probably the most interesting, because as far as I know, I mean, there's few places in West and West Africa that have been pictured so much than Fernando Po. It was probably also because it was also a crossroads of people, the freed slaves that were settled there, traders, I mean, Spain that tried to settle Cubans and prisoners, etc., etc. So it was a pell-mell of people which formed a society, and also which experimented with photography, which used photography as a means of reflecting about such political and social and economical developments. As regards the first question, what do we learn? I mean, of course, we do learn about the outer reality, but I mean, what I personally am much more interested in the social practice of photography. So the question, how did a society take in, adapt to photography, etc., and not only on the consumer side, but also on the producer side. So what were the global threats? What was the global, well, let me put it, how did people who were confronted with a new technology connect to the outer world, to other places where the same technology was integrated into a society, into social practices? So that's what I am very much interested in.
Merci. On va peut-être prendre une toute dernière question.
Merci beaucoup. Moi, j'avais une question qui s'adresse à Jörg Schneider aussi. En fait, j'étais assez étonnée de la remarque, et donc je voudrais juste être sûre de bien l'avoir comprise, lorsqu'il disait que l'Afrique était un monde sans images. Alors, c'est peut-être d'image photographique qu'il était question, puisque, a priori, enfin, tout le monde ici sait qu'il y a beaucoup de peintures, des appliqués, des bas-reliefs, enfin beaucoup d'images qui ont été produites pour transmettre l'histoire. Donc c'était juste pour comprendre quel était le sens de cette question. Et puis d'ailleurs, enfin, ou par ailleurs, les images photographiques, il y en a aussi pas mal. Donc pour avoir une précision par rapport au sens de cette remarque-là.
Bon, je pense que vraiment, ça dépend d'où on parle et de qui on parle. Certainement, disons, Sierra Leone, Freetown, quelqu'un qui était éduqué dans une école des missionnaires était beaucoup plus en contact avec des images. Mais à part de ça, dans les, disons, sociétés traditionnelles en Afrique de l'Ouest, qu'est-ce qu'il y avait, non? Il y avait les statues, donc il y avait les représentations 3D, et il y avait des représentations plutôt géométriques, mais la peinture, comme nous la connaissons de l'Europe, donc la représentation en image peinte, ça faisait pas partie de ces sociétés. Donc c'est pour cela que je dis c'était un monde qui n'était pas le même qu'en Europe, un monde d'images.
Merci. On va clôturer cette conférence maintenant. Je vais te laisser présenter. I guess it falls on Geoffrey to answer some of the big questions. Et on peut applaudir tout le monde, je pense, pour... Ouais.
Merci à tous. On va laisser tranquillement Monsieur Batchen s'installer. Et je vais faire une petite présentation, même si certainement vous êtes le genre de personne dont on dit qu'on ne doit pas les présenter. Mais je pense que ça vaut néanmoins toujours la peine. Si on a pensé à vous pour clôturer cette conférence, c'est évidemment pour rappeler que vous avez eu la gentillesse de collaborer à cet ouvrage. Et c'est vrai que quand on avait reçu votre réponse positive à notre demande, ça nous a beaucoup inspiré, ça nous a beaucoup soutenu dans ce grand projet. Mais c'était tout à fait évident pour nous de faire appel à vous, puisque vous êtes sans doute l'historien de la photographie le plus... vous pouvez vous installer. L'historien de la photographie le plus international, puisque vous avez publié de très nombreux livres. Le premier en 97, Burning with Desire, The Conception of Photography. Je pense que c'est la Burning with Desire, c'est la citation la plus souvent utilisée dans le monde photographique. Elle est citée très très souvent. Votre dernier livre est Inventing Photography, William Henry Fox Talbot and in the Bodleian Library, qui est publié cette année. et dont vous êtes aussi le plus international des historiens de la photographie, puisque vous avez publié dans de très nombreuses langues, 23 langues différentes pour traduire vos ouvrages. Pas grand-chose en français, je dois dire, mais ça va venir. Vous avez aussi enseigné sur plusieurs continents. Vous êtes quelqu'un qui s'est vraiment affranchi des frontières académiques et disciplinaires, puisque vous êtes chercheur, enseignant, vous êtes aussi commissaire, vous avez exposé au Brésil, au Japon, aux Pays-Bas, au Royaume-Uni, en Australie. Et vous vous êtes intéressé à divers objets très hybrides et très particuliers de la photographie, aussi l'art contemporain, et vous n'avez pas peur de connecter des choses très contemporaines avec des choses très anciennes et qui remontent à ces mystérieuses origines dont vous allez nous parler maintenant. Merci beaucoup de nous avoir fait l'honneur de participer à ce colloque de 2 jours.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much to everybody who has made it possible for me to contribute to the symposium. At this moment, I especially want to thank the translators for making me sound like I speak fluent French, which is of course important. I also, though, wanted to thank you, the audience, especially those of you who have been here for 2 full days. I have good news. This is the last talk, and in an hour you can see sunshine again, which I'm sure you are looking forward to. So, thank you for kindly inviting me to speak today. Where and when to begin that speaking? That is the problem facing anyone who wants to write a history for photography, and especially a history from a global perspective. The search for the beginnings of things, for their origins, is, as Jacques Derrida has pointed out, not just one metaphysical gesture among others, it is the metaphysical gesture, that which has been the most constant, most profound, and most potent. In that sense, the quest for the origins of photography is but one more instance of Western culture's perennial search for origins of all kinds. It is part of an ongoing effort to get to the essence of things, to experience essence in itself. It is, in other words, tantamount to a search for God. Derrida's own work endlessly reiterated the dangers of this effort, seeing the establishment of an origin point as the basis of a hierarchy that always wants to privilege the first term over all subsequent ones, and the beginning over all subsequent moments. The quest for origins is a metaphysical gesture, he therefore insists, but also a politicized one. Nevertheless, Derrida also recognizes that origin stories cannot be simply avoided or escaped from. They are a historical necessity. To put it bluntly, one must begin somewhere. Fair enough. But it has to be recognized that some ways of failing to escape this problem are better than others. The question of origins is therefore a peculiarly demanding one. We must ask ourselves not where and when, but also how to begin. However, these various starting points, where, when, how, or space, time, method, and let us add what to that list, the very identity of the thing whose history we are writing, are not so easily distinguished from each other. In my paper today, I want to persuade you that a complication of the where and the when might lead us to a different way of enacting the how and a similarly different conception of the what. It might lead us, in other words, to the development of another kind of history of photography altogether. Of course, the obvious places to begin any history of photography are Paris and London, where competing photographic processes devised by Jacques-Louis Mundet Daguerre and William Henry Fox Talbot were announced in January of 1839. These announcements prompted others to come forward until there were at least 24 claimants to photography's invention from 7 different countries. In each case, these inventors had sought to bring together the perspectival pictorial space provided by a camera obscura, a device used by Arabic astronomers in the 11th century and European artists from the 16th, and the capacity of surfaces coated in light-sensitive silver salts to automatically trace the image projected into such a camera. With Daguerre and Talbot having solved the problem of fixing that image in place, photography was quickly and inexorably imposed on the rest of the world. This, at least, is the usual story we are told. And indeed, there is no doubt that capturing scenes and people from elsewhere soon became a key motivation for European practitioners of the new art. Jules Itier was one such practitioner. An Inspector General in the French State Customs Service, he set sail for China in December 1843, carrying with him a complete daguerreotype outfit. From China, he travelled to the Philippines, Java, Borneo, and Indochina before beginning the long return voyage via Singapore, Ceylon, India, Aden, the Red Sea, and finally Egypt. While in Cairo in November 1845, Itier bought 30 new copper plates and boarded a cangia to sail up the Nile to Philae. Here he is, propped up against a part of his own vessel, the epitome of the global photographer as intrepid adventurer. In a short time, however, itinerant photographers like Itier were supplanted by European settlers and permanent studios, allowing a steady stream of photographs of various kinds to be sent back from Europe's colonies to its urban centres. This would include variants of these two daguerreotypes depicting groups of Indigenous Australians. They were taken in Melbourne in 1847 by a recently arrived English photographer, Douglas Kilburn. The photographer had to offer bribes to get his subjects into his studio. None of them consented to come a second time. The people in these pictures were not granted the subjecthood of proper names. I think we can assume then that Kilburn's photographs were taken to certify native Australia's presumed otherness. Kilburn's pictures show their subjects in contemporary dress, a mixture of animal skins, European blankets, ornaments, and scarification, along with wooden boomerangs and digging sticks. They speak, therefore, of the complex situation of these people in 1847, forced to negotiate a new world of cameras, pastoral leases, rapid urbanisation, and unfamiliar European customs, among them the ethnographic portrait and systematic genocide. These people may well have seen those two things as inextricably bound together. Daguerreotypes are unique and relatively fragile objects, but as images, some of these ones soon travelled abroad. 4 have survived to the present, including the 2 I have just shown you. However, images traced from other examples soon appeared as wood engravings in foreign publications. First, in a book about Australia published in 1848 in Edinburgh, where there has been a sex change engineered for one of the figures, and then in a further translation of this first engraving in a Danish magazine in 1849. In 1851, illustrations after these daguerreotypes even found their way into a journal devoted to religion, science, and general intelligence in India. But they found their widest audience when a number of them were reproduced as wood engravings in this January 1850 issue of the Illustrated London News, with an accompanying text that expressed the usual racial prejudices of the time. This single item, therefore, speaks to the extraordinary mobility of the photographic image in the mid-19th century. Each of the daguerreotypes from which these images were derived would have been destroyed in the process of being traced and copied onto a woodblock for carving. And yet, as photographic ghosts, these images circulated throughout the British Empire and beyond, in this case travelling as daguerreotypes from Australia to England, before travelling back again to Australia in translated form in the pages of the Illustrated London News, even while also being reproduced in Scotland, Denmark, and India. This sharing of such images of foreign peoples, their difference signalled by the darkness of their skin and the strangeness of their dress, allowed the British Empire to maintain a sense of its own coherence as an apparently benign and yet all-seeing, all-powerful colonial enterprise. But this political coherence was at the cost of the coherence of the photograph being used to certify it. That photograph has been erased in order for its reproduction to come into being, a reproduction that is further splintered into copies and derivations as it travels across the globe. If you're a settler in the outback of Australia, reading your copy of the Illustrated London News, as these gentlemen were in 1850, you very probably would have never seen any of Kilburn's daguerreotypes in the flesh. Your first encounter with these images would have been in the pages of a newspaper that had just arrived from England. Here then is an example in which at least 2 points of origin have to be accounted for simultaneously. Ethnography and photography have a lot in common. The establishment of the Aborigines Protection Society in Britain in 1837, whose first object was the collection of authentic information concerning the character, habits and wants of the uncivilized tribes, neatly coincides with Daguerre's earliest successful daguerreotypes. The two practices, anthropology and photography, also appeared to share a common desire, the desire to make knowledge visible by faithfully repeating what was seen by the eye. It wasn't long before the ethnographic photograph established its own conventions, an effort to turn the colonial gaze into a kind of visual science. Frontal and side views were taken of selected subjects, following the presumptions of phrenology. This procedure visually transformed those subjects into types, thereby making them available for a derogatory comparison with what was always assumed to be their superior, men like myself. Through the production and circulation of systematic image systems like this, the bourgeois Caucasian body sought to distinguish itself from its ethnic other. Whether motivated by casual curiosity, anthropological or archaeological science, or imperial ambition, ethnographic photographs of this kind imposed a peculiarly European articulation of space and time on all those who were subjected to it. This association with European cultural values and colonial interests didn't prevent local savants from taking up the practice of photography, or local rulers from commissioning portraits of themselves in order to demonstrate their interest in and conversance with the latest modern technologies. Thus, we find formal daguerreotype portraits being made of Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, in 1844, and King Mongkut of Siam in about 1856, alongside a multitude of less exalted ethnographic headshots and picturesque scenes gathered from across the globe. In the usual rendition of photography's origin story, Europe is the centre and everywhere else becomes a mere periphery. Photography travels from Paris to the rest of the world, enacting in pictorial form both imperial ambition and colonial values, values repeated in the kind of linear model of history with which we are all so familiar. According to that model, photographs made by people living in that periphery are inevitably regarded as secondary and unoriginal, as a mere copying of what has already occurred at the centre. Focused on surviving first photographs, which were inevitably made by travellers arriving from Europe, such a history therefore can't help but repeat a familiar tale of Western primacy and colonial dependence. But perhaps photography's global emergence is not quite as straightforward as that tale would have it. Perhaps, if we look a little more closely, we may well find that the periphery was always already there at the centre. What if, as we have already noted, we could show that the copy sometimes comes before the original, or at least coincides with it? How would that complication change the way we go about writing a global history for photography? Consider again, for example, those initial announcements of photography's invention. In his address to the Academy of Sciences on the 7th of January 1839, Dominique Francois Arago unfavourably compared exposure times of the daguerreotype in France to those he imagines will pertain in the stronger sunlight of Egypt. I quote, "In our climate and in ordinary weather, 8 or 10 minutes, but under a pure sky like that of Egypt, 2, perhaps 1 minute might suffice to execute the most complex design." Unquote. The first photographs of Egypt's ancient monuments will not be made until late November 1839. And yet here, in Arago's announcement of Daguerre's invention, we find a version of Africa, its difference from Europe made explicit in both temporal and ecological terms, already inscribed within the French version of photography's origin story. These images were derived from daguerreotypes exposed in Egypt by the French painter Goupil-Fesquet, who travelled through the Middle East in the company of his uncle, the painter Horace Vernet. As Vernet reported on the 6th of November 1839, "We keep daguerreotyping away like lions." The following day, they photographed the exterior of Pasha Mehmed Ali's harem building in Alexandria in Egypt, using a 2-minute exposure. That plate was traced over and destroyed during the process of the transfer of a copy of its image onto a steel plate, which was then engraved and printed. All this in order to be able to join many other similar prints in the first fascicle of Noël Lerabour's publication, Excursion de Guérienne. Once again, the copy displaces, even replaces the original, and Africa is there from the beginning. So too is Australia. For a similar inscription of an always already elsewhere can be found within Talbot's first official description of photogenic drawing, delivered to the Royal Society on the 31st of January 1839. He speaks there of his earliest photographs as having been, and I quote, "very perfect but extremely small pictures, such as without great stretch of the imagination might be supposed to be the work of some Lilliputian artist." Lilliput was, of course, one of the fictional sites featured in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels of 1726. Fictional though it may be, Swift included a map in his book that located the island of Lilliput a little to the northwest of Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, about where Adelaide in Australia is today. As the Australian scholar Ross Gibson has written, Swift deliberately chooses the known areas of New Holland and Van Diemen's Land as reference points from which he can draw up a society of wonders and radically altered perspectives. Making themselves without the aid of the artist's pencil, and appearing as tonally reversed, inverted and upside-down images in the back of a camera obscura, and thereby overturning all fixed traditions of picture-making, Talbot's first photographs were, in other words, imagined by their inventor to be antipodean, and therefore entirely foreign productions. In both cases, what we witness in these foundational texts by Arago and Talbot is the concoction of an imaginary photography whose identity can be articulated only in terms of certain differences from a European way of doing things. What then would a history of this imagined photography look like if we begin from the source of these differences and look back at Europe from there? Australia, for example, has its own photographic prehistory, even before Talbot incorporated a fictional one into his account. After all, soldier settler James Wallace was making perspectival sketches of the landscape of New South Wales with a camera lucida instrument as early as 1815. And in May of the same year, the Sydney Gazette advertised the sale in Pitt Street of a small camera obscura. By the 26th of January 1839, before anyone in Australia had heard of the invention of photography in Europe, the Australian newspaper was able to report that a comedian named Meredith had, quote, fitted up a camera obscura of very large dimensions, the first of the kind which will be exhibited in Australia. The following week, the Sydney Monitor and Commercial Advertiser offered a more detailed description of what was on offer, telling us that Mr. Meredith had installed the instrument at the local racecourse during a cricket match. The story was headed by a quotation from Shakespeare, "Hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature," that was soon to be a common phrase in photographers' advertisements. The amusing Meredith then went on as follows, and I quote, "When the eye and taste shall be satiated with the there surrounding views, minutely detailed in his exhibition, the camera obscura will be removed to some equally eligible situation in the vicinity of Sydney. J.M., that is Mr. Meredith, particularly invites the attendance of artists, as the exhibition being panoramic, their intent in taking such views would be furthered in an incalculable manner. To those gentlemen who fortune has kindly placed upon the couch of affluence and who roll luxuriantly around their fine estates, J.M. would recommend the camera obscura, as by its means they might impart a just idea of their estates and lands to their anxious friends in the mother country. And should this meet their view, J.M. can with ease transport it to any site they might propose." Unquote. Already then, Meredith is proposing that camera-made images produced in Australia should be sent back to England to represent the new colony there. He thereby pioneered a flow of camera-mediated images from periphery to centre, rather than the other way around. A daguerreotype camera and its related equipment did not arrive in Australia until the 29th of March 1841, on board a French ship called the Justine, that had arrived in Sydney after first visiting New Zealand. However, settlers in Australia had already read about the invention of the daguerreotype. One has heard of writing by steam, but drawing by sunshine or moonshine is a novelty for which the world is indebted to Monsieur Daguerre of Paris. They read all this on page 4 of their copies of The Colonist, published in Sydney on Saturday, 1st of June, 1839. The article goes on to ask its readers, and I quote, "to figure to yourself a mirror which, after having received your image, gives you back your portrait, indelible as a picture, and a much more exact resemblance, pushed to a degree of perfection that art can never reach." Unquote. These readers were asked, in other words, to conjure a mode of representation which did not yet exist, as no daguerreotype portraits had by that date been made in Paris or anywhere else. Notice how the correspondent once again conjures an imagined Africa in the midst of this story about developments in Paris. I quote, "It may be presumed that the son of Africa would give him instantaneous images of natural objects in full life and action." Unquote. In a later entry in the same newspaper, the daguerreotype is described as capable of obtaining an exact representation of any object or scene, with the Cathedral of Notre Dame engraving itself perfectly on the plate. With Talbot's photogenic drawings, on the other hand, by means of the camera obscura, the image obtained is white, but the ground is beautifully coloured and readily obtainable, either sky blue, yellow, rose colour, or black. Objects the most minute are obtained, the delicate hairs on the leaves of plants, the most minute and tiny bivalve calyx, nay, even a shadow, the emblem of all that is most fleeting in this world, is fettered by the spell of the invention and remains perfect and permanent long after it has been given back to the sunbeam which produced it. In other words, colonists in Australia were able to read a vivid word picture of photography long before they got to see an actual photograph. As befits the theme of my talk, the imaginary preceded the actual by at least 18 months. As it happens, wood-engraved facsimiles of photogenic drawings made using Talbot's process were published in English journals as early as April 1839. In that month, the Mirror of Literature, Amusement and Instruction published an engraved version of a photogenic drawing contact print of 3 sprigs of fern on its cover, printed in rust to imitate the look of the original photograph. The plant specimens conjured nature, photography's generative force, but also the science of botany and its particular representational demands. This, then, is how most people in both Britain and its colonies first encountered a photographic image. For them, their first photograph was a second-order reproduction, a process where the copy came before the original. The 3 ferns were reproduced to illustrate a text printed inside by Dr. Golding Bird, titled A Treatise on Photogenic Drawing. Bird, the inventor of the stethoscope, published at least 2 other such essays during 1839. Bird's essays are relevant to my story about the inversion of periphery and centre because it is another reminder that colonists in Australia were able to read about photography long before they ever saw a photograph in the flesh or had a chance to make one for themselves. You're looking at an 1856 ambrotype portrait of the English-born painter Conrad Martens, who arrived in Sydney in 1835 and lived and worked there until his death in 1878. Sometime before August 1840, this same Conrad Martens carefully wrote out a recipe for photogenic drawings in his notebooks, the source being a reprinted essay by Bird that Martens read in his copy of The Visitor, or Monthly Instructor, of 1839. This was a magazine published in London by the Religious Tract Society, which was obviously also available to homesick readers in Australia. Based on his reading, and perhaps on his own experiments, Martens recommended using, and I quote, glazed writing paper of the thinnest kind, and the stopping solution recommended by Mr. Bird, in order to obtain what he described as the dark colour produced by the action of the sun. Martens also suggests applying the photogenic fluid using a brush, and doing so by candlelight. Although we have no other evidence that Martens made any photogenic drawings himself, I think we can reasonably say that he had photographed in his imagination well before any camera arrived in Australia. Photographic images flowed across Australia's borders in other ways too. In September 1840, Sir John Franklin, Governor of Tasmania between 1836 and 1843, received in Hobart some examples of photographic images, lithographs of fossils and some coral originally engraved on a daguerreotype plate. They had been exposed at the Royal Polytechnic Institution in London by a man named Ibbotson. These lithographs were published in a London journal, the Westminster Review, in 1840. As Franklin's benefactor, William Buckland, wrote in his accompanying letter, there is no calculating the importance of this invention for multiplying figures in natural history. The year before, on the 19th of September 1839, Franklin would also have read a reprinted American essay in the Launceston Advertiser, telling of Talbot's competing invention of photogenic drawing. I quote, "The phantasmagoria of inventions passes rapidly before us, resulting in a revolution in art." Shortly after that, on the 18th of January 1840, he would have learned from the colonist that a daguerreotype had been taken in London by a visiting Frenchman, a Monsieur St. Croix. By March of 1840, Australian newspapers provide evidence that the language of photography had already become part of the vernacular, with the Hobart Town Courier using the word daguerreotype to indicate what it called the extraordinary resemblance between Hobart and Cape Town, Africa again. All this, remember, before any photograph had yet been made on Australian soil. As we've heard, a daguerreotype camera and its related equipment did finally arrive in Sydney on the 29th of March, 1841. We have to let them take a breath occasionally. A report in a local newspaper announced the sale of this apparatus on April 13, and it was reported as having produced the first Australian photograph of Bridge Street and part of George Street. That photograph is no longer extant, but it is, unlike the other evidence recounted here, reported in every single history of Australian photography. The invisible presence of this first photograph neatly summarises my argument. In Australia, at least, photography long preceded photographs, arriving in the colony as a written description, a rhetorical aspiration, an imagined image, and a transfigured facsimile, well before it was manifested in a local daguerreotype picture. A similar story could be told about the advent of photography in India. At the time of the announcement of the invention of photography in January 1839, there had already been a British presence in India for 250 years. In December 1839, the Bombay Times published 3 articles about daguerreotypy. However, it wasn't until the 5th of March 1840 that the Calcutta Courier was able to report the making of the first daguerreotypes in India, apparently so detailed that, through a microscope, a bird could be seen perched on a building. That photograph has not survived to the present. Later commentators based in India complained that local conditions made it difficult to make good photographs. As the committee adjudicating the Madras Photographic Society's medals in 1859 argued, and I quote, "Many circumstances conspire in this country to render the pursuit of photographic art more difficult and less satisfactory than in the more temperate climate of Europe. The intense heat, light, and frequently too, in some parts of the country, an atmosphere overloaded with moisture, form formidable obstacles to the operations of the photographer in the tropics." Despite these perceived differences from Europe, the first professional photography studio opened in India in 1849, and a number of exceptional daguerreotypes were produced during the following decade, including this one of women grinding some material in Calcutta. By the 1850s, commercial photography studios abounded, much as they did in Europe. Where am I? Even my own ancestor, an Indian-born settler named Elizabeth Hinder, seen here, was photographed in Calcutta in about 1855 and then sent this daguerreotype to her son, who had emigrated to Sydney. So my story about the inversion of copies and originals, centres and peripheries, has a quite personal element to it. But all these efforts with the French daguerreotype process were apparently preceded by the invention of a photography that was distinctively Indian in origins. The Asiatic Journal of January 1840 refers to an address delivered by William O'Shaughnessy to a meeting held in Calcutta on the 2nd of October 1839. In this address, O'Shaughnessy, quote, gave some details of photographic drawing by means of the sun's light, of which the principle wholly differs from that of Europe. Professor O'Shaughnessy uses, it seems, a solution of gold and produces many various tints from a light rose colour through purple down to deep black and what is more extraordinary, green, unquote. Extraordinary indeed, as this photography that wholly differs from that of Europe seems to have been canvassed in India before any known photographs had been made there. The same could be said about the introduction of photography in Brazil. The invention of the daguerreotype process was announced in the Rio de Janeiro-based newspaper Jornal do Comércio on the 1st of May 1839, where it was called a revolution in the arts of design. A few months later, on October 26th, a French-born painter, printer and inventor named Hercule Florence, a resident of Campinas, published a press release in the Sao Paulo-based newspaper Fênix. In it, he stated that he'd been working on photographic printing methods for the previous 9 years, leading to his discovery, as he called it, of the fixing of images in the camera obscura through the action of light. Florence had arrived in Brazil in 1824 as a 20-year-old draftsman, from Monaco. He soon joined an expedition to explore the Amazon River basin, recording the look and sound of the birds that he encountered there. He devised a systematic means of notating those sounds, which he called zoophony. When he returned to live just outside of Sao Paulo, he tried to invent his own system of mass production, polygraphy, in order to publish his notations. It may have been these efforts that led him to experiment with light-sensitive chemicals and thus to make photographic images. In January 1833, Florence records his attempts to make paper photographic prints from drawings made on glass sheets and using stencils, and also made photographic contact print copies of a mason's diploma and of pharmacy labels, as you see here. His recognition that the dissemination of facsimiles might be one of photography's most useful and commercially lucrative functions proved to be particularly prescient, forecasting efforts along these lines made among many other early practitioners in later years. Among his other experiments, Florence also sought to make photographic facsimiles of drawings on glass, drawings that he scratched through a surface coated with a mixture of gum arabic and soot. He says, I decided to draw on a glass pane in a natural manner, he wrote in January 1833. And then I put sheets of paper under this glass and will have copies from nature. This is a technique that later came to be called cliché vert. When retold today, the story of photography's invention tends to emphasize the capturing of images formed in the back of a camera obscura, as if this action represents the essence of the photographic medium. Florence claimed to have made these sorts of images too, using a sheet of paper coated with silver nitrate and a 4-hour exposure to make an image of the view from his window, showing the neighbouring roofs and parts of the sky. He also later referred to camera-made photographs of the facade of a jail in Campinas and of a bust of Lafayette. Although modestly calling these poor results, he nevertheless was able to record what he called lines, forms, and contours harmonious in themselves without the help of the human hand. Florence claimed that his own discoveries were, quote, born of a structured and premeditated calculation. And indeed, his notebooks indicate that he followed an approved scientific method in systematically experimenting with dozens of different chemicals, including gold, cobalt, calcium, mercury, phosphorus, chlorine, silver, and even urine, and their combinations in order to achieve his aims. Quote, I printed by means of photography drawings as clear, as delicate as the finest engraving, unquote. There is something wonderfully poetic about an arc of inquiry that can, in a few short years, go from the notation of sound in a musical system comprised of 18 figures, motivated by the, quote, the idea of making the voices of animals a new object of the study of nature, to the notation of light as a chemical mode of printing images au naturel. Each of Florence's experiments concerned the transmutation of one medium into another, of the sounds of animals into written notations, of these notations into printed multiples, and of already printed labels into photographic copies. Perhaps most strikingly, Florence used the word photographie in his manuscript notes in 1833, the first person to do so. As Florence himself put it in a letter to a local newspaper in 1839, he said he could not dispute anyone's discovery because two people can have the same idea, unquote. Nevertheless, when Florence's press release was reprinted in Rio 2 months later, it was prefaced by a journalist's note stating, quote, let readers compare the dates and decide if the world owes the discovery of photography, or at the very least of polygraphy, to Europe or to Brazil. Wherever we look, the same dilemma seems to arise. Where, when, and how does photography begin, and of what does photography consist? Let's consider those questions once again, but this time while pondering the situation in Japan. There exists today only one daguerreotype that can be attributed to Japanese photographers, a formal studio portrait of the feudal lord Shimatsu Nariakira from as late as 1857. Around the same period, there were also some paper calotypes made in Japan, like this one. But is this where we should begin our histories, with these first Japanese-made photographs? After all, Europeans have been in contact with Japan since the 16th century, especially Portuguese Jesuits and Dutch traders. As a consequence, some Western pictorial influences can be discerned in pre-photographic images made in Japan, usually in the work of mavericks and in concert with Japanese and Chinese pictorial traditions. The camera obscura, for example, was introduced into Japanese culture in 1718 via China and was employed by some woodblock artists in that century. A well-known maker of woodblock prints named Bakin Kyokyuti included a scene showing the use of a pinhole camera in the home of a wealthy merchant in a book he published in 1803. The device used was described as a Bidoro Kagami. In the Edo period, Bidoro Kagami meant a glass mirror or a telescope that used glass lenses. But in this case, the term might be referring to a room-type camera obscura inside which people enjoyed seeing scenery projected on a wall of the room while sitting on a floor of that room. It is said that the first photographs to be made in Japan were taken by Dutch visitors in 1843, although the camera left with the ship and no photograph has survived. By 1848, Japanese scholars of Dutch learning who imported apparatuses from Holland in that year were struggling to master the daguerreotype process, which the Japanese initially called printing mirrors. These efforts, once again, have not survived. The history of Japanese photography, and not only Japanese photography, is haunted by such ghosts. Photography, what we call light writing, was eventually called shashin in Japanese, literally to copy truth or to reproduce reality. So, Japanese speakers did not regard photography as a way of drawing or writing with light, but rather as a mode of picture making that is a faithful reflection of the original subject. In fact, shashin was used in Japan long before the arrival of photography, having come into that country's language in the 18th century along with a Western-influenced style of Chinese painting. Thus, even before photography has been invented, Japanese scholars were using the word shashin to refer to Western-influenced painting that employed shading, perspective, and other familiar Western realist devices. So, shashin means, before all else, Western picture, whether it's produced by painting or photography or any other medium. Despite these tentative experiments, Western ways were largely rejected by the Japanese until the arrival of a threatening American naval squadron under Commodore Perry in 1853. The Japanese were, of course, interested in the strange ways of European visitors and the apparatuses that they brought with them. Among these apparatuses was a daguerreotype camera operated by a man named Eliphalet Brown. In 1854, a scroll was issued in Japan that included an image of this photographer at work, taking an image of a courtesan, her body being held steady by the usual metal armature. There are actually a number of versions of this so-called Black Ship scroll, each of them depicting this event in a slightly different way. In each, however, the Americans are shown as strange beings, their tongues sticking out in apparent appreciation of the seductive allure of the courtesan. In one of these variants, the subjects of the photographic session have been turned into a samurai and his consort. Interestingly, the samurai is shown as someone quite conversant with the odd conventions of the daguerreotype process. He has arranged his swords on the wrong side of his body, in expectation of them being laterally reversed in the mirror image of the finished daguerreotype. Not many of the 400 daguerreotypes taken by Brown in Japan between May 1853 and August 1854 have survived, after a fire destroyed the warehouse in which they were being kept in San Francisco. However, these two are exceptions. It's again interesting to note how each of these men responded to the experience of being photographed. A samurai always wore his sword on the left side of his body, and all Japanese fold the kimono left over right. Since the daguerreotype is a mirror image, subjects would have to dress in reverse to create the proper appearance in the final portrait. The man on the left did so. The man on the right, a higher-ranking samurai and the interpreter for the Perry mission, did not. As I say, most of Brown's daguerreotypes have not survived to the present. However, 19 of those daguerreotypes were translated into lithographic images by 4 different firms and published in January 1856 as part of the report on the expedition by the United States Congress, with the second edition issued later in the same year. As many as 18,000 copies of these images may have been distributed. 2 of the report's lithographs are of particular interest. One was titled Temple at Tumai, Lu Chu, and captioned as Drawn from Nature by the expedition's draftsman, the Dresden painter Wilhelm Heine. It shows a village scene in Okinawa shortly after the expedition arrived there on May 26, 1853. Among the European figures, if you look to the left there, is one operating a daguerreotype camera, assisted by a Japanese man carrying a plate holder. The camera is being pointed at 3 seated Japanese men, with an American sailor standing behind them, presumably helping them to compose themselves. Another lithograph, Afternoon Gossip, Lu Chu, and captioned Daguerreotypes by Brown Jr., shows these same 3 seated men, 2 of them smoking pipes and 1 fanning himself. Thus, if we just go back, you can see we have shown the taking of the daguerreotype and an image of the daguerreotype that was then taken, with each of these scenes, though, represented in another medium again, lithography. So which of all of these images, daguerreotypes, calotypes, woodblock prints, and lithographs, should be included in our histories of the origins of photography in Japan? And should that history also include the earlier daguerreotypes taken of rescued Japanese sailors who ended up in San Francisco in 1851? Should it include the wood engravings made after these daguerreotypes and published in New York's Illustrated News in 1853? These, after all, are the first photographic images of Japanese people to be produced and widely circulated. Once again, we look for an original and we find that multiple copies have got there before us. Where and when does photography begin? Of what does photography consist? These questions seem to be inseparable. Time, space, and identity interact, at least within our historical accounts of photography, and every origin appears to be displaced by a copy. How can we invent a form of history that can appropriately articulate this kind of impossible convolution? Ponder, in this context, the lithographs of native peoples that appeared in Dumont d'Urville's Voyage to the South Pole and in Oceania, published in 23 volumes between 1842 and 1847. These lithographs are reproductions of daguerreotypes of life casts made by the French photographer Louis-Auguste Bisson. As pronounced by the phrenologist Émile Blanchard, and I quote, "To entrust this work to an artist was to risk seeing the forms altered." Hence, the employment of a photographer as an intermediary between plaster cast and the lithographer's stone. In the end, Blanchard declared, the marvellous way to complete this process would be the ability to engrave, or better yet, to lithograph with the aid of the daguerreotype. The plaster moulds for these casts were produced by the phrenologist Pierre-Marie Alexandre de Moutier during Dumont's last exploratory voyage through the Pacific, which took place between 1837 and 1840, and therefore before photography was available. These moulds, equivalent to a negative or matrix, were then taken back to Paris, where they were turned into plaster three-dimensional positive impressions, like this one. Most of Bisson's daguerreotypes of these impressions have not survived. As the editors of Le Lithography explained, quote, "Put directly on the glass that covers the daguerreotype proof, the most transparent piece of paper becomes absolutely opaque. Applied directly to the metal plate, it is almost impossible to not destroy the photographic drawing, which the slightest friction makes disappear." Unquote. It is thought that Bisson made his daguerreotypes in Paris in about 1841-1842, the same dates given to his surviving photographs of skulls of Polynesians plundered from graves by the Dumont expedition. As you can see, the skulls are photographed from front and side according to the conventions of phrenology, thus placing them into a kind of taxonomy, seeking, as already mentioned, to scientifically establish racial, indeed racist, hierarchies. Bisson's daguerreotypes, 6 of them in this example, were then transformed into lithograph images. How exactly these images were converted into lithographic prints is unknown. Whatever the means, each recess, detail, and shadow is recorded with uncanny accuracy. It's possible they were created by dot tracing over the daguerreotype, damaging it in the process. Traced, in any case, is the word used by Blanchard to describe the process. However, it is also possible that a thin layer of gelatin was deposited on the daguerreotype image so that the image could be lifted off and transferred to the lithographic stone and thereby printed in ink. As an example, 4 life casts were made of Maori subjects from the over 50 amassed during the voyage. 3 plaster impressions were made in the Otago region of New Zealand, while Matua Tawai's likeness, seen here, was acquired during the party's sojourn in Colloque. Such a casting process must have been a hugely invasive experience, probably occurring only because of a barter between the French and their Maori subjects. We know, for example, that one couple allowed themselves to be cast in exchange for a military jacket. Another agreed to the procedure in return for medical services. In order to gain the most accurate impression, the individuals would have had their entire faces plastered with some kind of implement in the nose, allowing them to breathe. Accounts tell of cases where, on failing to convince any sitters, Dumoutier would lead clandestine parties to nearby grave sites to dig up skulls, as he had elsewhere. Having been transferred into lithographs, Bisson's daguerreotypes of plaster casts were then bound into volumes like this, allowing a phrenological comparison from one plate to the next. The plaster busts were photographed by Bisson in 3/4 view, allowing a view of face, ear and skull shape, and they're often captioned with individual names, although those names are somewhat disputed, at least, for example, amongst Maori in New Zealand. In other words, it's possible they just made them up. Their lithographic reproductions are therefore presented as phrenological studies, as portraits and as ethnographic exemplars. As a consequence of the life-casting process, the indigenous men and women in them are shown in a state of perpetual slumber, face calm and eyes closed against both the onslaught of colonialism and the passing of time. Eyelashes, tattoos and creases in the skin are all indiscriminately captured for posterity, including the scratches on this woman's face, perhaps acquired in a ritual display of grief. It's as if each of these people has been cryogenically preserved for some unknown future, the future that is now. De Vee's vessel, the Astrolabe, reached Hobart in Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania, off the southern coast of Australia, in late 1839. Perhaps finding it difficult to persuade Tasmanian natives to undertake the invasive life-casting procedure, Dumoutier acquired 2 portrait busts in the neoclassical style of Waretti and Truccanini, made by the English sculptor Benjamin Law in Hobart in 1835-1836. These busts were then brought back to Paris, daguerreotyped, and transferred via lithography into these volumes. Once again, we find a copy is already there at the origin, a copy that here poses via the naturalization process of having been photographed as an original. Historical spectres, these indigenous subjects are made visible only through a dizzying series of indexical transmutations, involving 2 sets of plaster casts, a daguerreotype photograph, a tracing process, and a lithographic print. Here they are, sitting stolidly before us, seen but not seen. The cast is an exact trace of their faces, and the image a photographic cast of the plaster one. The plaster mould was taken well before photography arrived in Australia, and yet here it is, in photographic form. Almost magically, it seems as if Bisson's daguerreotypy has been able to peer back through time to capture these people as they looked before photography. Once again, then, these images offer us the strange conundrum of a photography that comes both before and after the photograph. Time has been folded back on itself, confusing the distinction between copy and original, as well as between before and after. These images offer us, in other words, an experience of something which might otherwise be considered impossible. Accordingly, and especially when considered in conjunction with my other examples, they also prompt us to rethink the familiar history of photography's origins. Could these lithographs, after daguerreotypes, after plaster casts, after indigenous bodies offer us a model for a different kind of historical accounting of photography's global origins. The need for this different model becomes particularly acute in the context of a decolonizing perspective anxious to displace the usual emphasis on Europe and the First World as the exclusive origin point of our contemporary civilization. By looking at a range of origin stories, including those found in Australia, Brazil, India, and Japan, I have sought to conjure a photography that always seems to be coming before its origins in Europe. These examples suggest that a center-periphery model, in which an origin is always posited as having already occurred in Paris or London, is simply not adequate as a way of writing the history of the photography that was experienced by those living on the periphery. How then to proceed? First, we need to recognize that the search for origins itself obeys the circular logic of an endless return. By making that circularity a self-conscious element of our own accounts, by making the place and time of photography's origin undecidable, we at least acknowledge that any such account is an interested political discourse rather than simply an empirical one. Second, we should also recognize that otherness is already there, inscribed at the center, and that equally elements of the center are always already scattered throughout the periphery. We need to complicate the presumed distinction between these two positions, conceding Europe its place as the source of industrial modernity, even while finding ways to look back from the other side of that process and articulate the experience of those colonies whose resources, both material and human, made that modernity possible. In other words, the challenge is to invent a kind of historical narrative that displaces the fixity of any particular place and time and inscribes in that same space a multitude of dispersed beginnings. This would be a palimpsestic narrative in which the relationship of original and copy is kept in permanent motion, a history of unending temporal and spatial displacements that, in the omnivorous breadth of its embrace, can at last encompass not just Europe, but the entire world. My paper has attempted to be one small step in that direction. Thank you for listening. Oh. Yes. Did you fall asleep?
Oh, non, je crois qu'on est tous sans voix après une conclusion aussi brillante et aussi inspirante depuis ces 2 jours. Merci beaucoup pour avoir ouvert à nouveau toutes ces perspectives et je crois d'une certaine façon aussi synthétiser toutes les pistes qu'on a ouvertes depuis 2 jours. Donc merci à tous d'avoir été si fidèles pendant 2 jours et je pense que comme on a vu pendant ces 2 jours, toutes ces histoires de photographie et de questions se résument beaucoup à des relations. Donc je pense que ce colloque, c'était aussi un bon moyen de créer des nouvelles relations et des nouvelles connexions entre des histoires, mais aussi entre des personnes. Donc restons ensemble et restons connectés pour plus tard. Merci encore.
Thank you.